So we're going to be speaking to Rami Jarrah, a Syrian journalist from Damascus, currently in a southern city in Turkey, and also Charles Lister, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, after the news. We've got about a minute before that. Rami, I just want you to pick up on that point that Ralph made briefly, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll talk at length after the news. Humanitarian pressure, is that the way forward to change things in Syria and Aleppo?
That is definitely one element that is needed. And what we're seeing now, and you were mentioning before, there are many people who have sent heartfelt messages to Syrians inside and Syrians outside, and to organizations that are involved in the current situation of what's happening in Aleppo. And a lot of people are asking, what is it that we can do? Because they've seen that there are protests happening. They've seen people go out into the streets and call for and try to be that voice for Syrians inside.
And even
but not seeing a change.
Yeah, and the former Chancellor here in the UK stood up in the Commons this week and said, governments around the world have failed, including the government that I was a part of. Do stay with us, Rami. We'll also bring in Charles Lister, and we will carry on talking about this after the latest BBC World News. Besieged, rebel-held city in Syria has now begun, and we were talking about what was happening on the ground, the messages people were receiving from people inside Aleppo. And then we began to talk a little bit about what can be done. So many people getting in touch with us from around the world saying they want to help, but they feel frustrated and they don't know how to do it. Well, with us for the next half an hour, the next probably 10 or 15 minutes, Abdulaziz al-Mashi, still with me here in the World Have Your Say studio. He's Syrian and co-founder of the Syria Solidarity Campaign. Rami Jarrah is a Syrian journalist from Damascus, but currently in Turkey. And Charles Lister is senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington. I want to play all of you a clip that we received via WhatsApp earlier this week from Liberia.
BBC World Have Your Say. I am Mr. Rafael Okoro calling from Africa. I want to use this media through BBC to call on the international community to stop Russia, Iran and Assad on all the atrocities they are committing in Eastern Aleppo. The world are watching in vain why these type of atrocities are going on. The United Nations should rise up and say no. The world cannot pretend as if that they don't know what is going on in Aleppo. Let the world stand up and say no to the atrocities committed in Eastern Aleppo.
So say no to the atrocities, and that really just sums up many of the messages we've received here on World Have Your Say over the last weeks and months. Charles Lister, it's not that simple, is it? So where does it begin?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot to be said for the power of popular opinion and popular protest, and I do think that can have a certain effect. But I think the real unfortunate reality that we've faced right now is that the siege and the offensive on Aleppo has been perfectly timed, if you want to put it in that way, by Assad, the Russian government, and by Iran, in the sense that the international community and the West in general is in a kind of state of paralysis at the moment. With the political change in Washington, there's really been no movement whatsoever here and in the White House in terms of moving things on Syria. So I don't know. I mean, I think, we have to resign ourselves to the fact that Aleppo has obviously fallen. I think it's an extremely good thing from a humanitarian standpoint that people are being allowed out now. I think that's a lot better than the worst case scenario. But our focus needs now to be placed on making sure that these kind of things can't happen again in wherever is next, whether it's suburbs of Damascus or in Idlib or anywhere else. We now will have a responsibility to make sure that these kind of crimes can't be committed again, and pressuring new and incoming governments in places like the United States to make sure that they don't allow them to happen, whatever hope we may have of doing that ourselves.
Rami, come in on this.
First, I'd like to say hello to Charles and to Abdulaziz, to yourself in the studio. I agree that it's a very complicated situation, and the fact that we are here at this stage where many of the states that were involved in this conflict have taken that step back and left the door open for Russia and its counterparts, and Iran and Hezbollah, which are basically a militia on the ground that is driven, we could say fairly religiously and fundamentally driven, just as is being accused on the other side, on the rebel side. I do believe that we do have a way out of this. I do believe that public pressure plays a very strong role in all of this, and I think that even right now, I'm not saying that it's just your program, but I think in general, the media fails to cover what is happening or fails to give enough attention to what is happening in Syria when it doesn't see that there is that pressure, people in the streets moving. And now what we're seeing is a lot of people who do want to see a stop to the killing, do want to see an end to this madness. People are in the streets now, and they're saying we want a stop to this, just like our fellow friend who sent that heartfelt message. And this is applying the pressure. It's making it it's making it a demand that this has to be out there. There has to be more awareness. These countries that have taken that step back did have a responsibility, and they still have a responsibility to prevent this from happening. They are part of the United Nations. The United Nations has a responsibility towards its citizens in Aleppo. And I just want to mention...
But Rami, what is the answer? Because, for the last few years here on the BBC World Service, on this programme, we've been connecting with people in Aleppo. We've been telling their stories, and they've been really painful stories to listen to. But in reality, public pressure to do what? For the Americans to bomb Syria, for there to be troops on the ground? What is it that's actually going to stop this war?
A lot of different people will have different opinions on this, but I genuinely believe that a political solution is the only solution in Syria. A military solution has proven that it has not gotten us anywhere. It has thrown us back into medieval times. What we're seeing in Aleppo now is just a replica of what we've seen elsewhere in the country. We saw this in suburbs of Damascus. And the strategy by the Syrian regime and the Russians has been to throw all these people that they're besieging and driving and putting down into submission as to take them to another city, in which might well be Idlib and might be the next stop, what we're going to see next after Aleppo has been totally cleansed, as Dr. Judd was mentioning earlier. A political solution. We have a political body that represents the Syrian opposition. The head of the negotiation council is a female Christian. I'm mentioning this just because there's so much propaganda and distortion of information out there that's trying to portray the Syrian opposition as a fundamentalist Islamic opposition, when the truth is that we have people on the ground that are being radicalized because they feel isolated, they feel unrepresented, they feel that those that represent them have no leverage on international soil. And this is true because the opposition has been ignored in terms of political efforts. The United States and Russia have sat on the table and spoken in isolation as though it was just them that deserved to sit on that table when there is an opposition to represent. So pushing for that political solution, it's possible, but what we need is public pressure, because what we're seeing is this neo-fascism growth within Trump growing into power. In Europe, we're seeing the right begin to take power. And in Syria, what we're seeing is very similar to that.
Well, that is an element, isn't it? And I know that Abdulaziz is sitting opposite me, and I know that there is a call to action. You are getting people out in the streets, aren't you?
Yes, we have been calling for actions since 2011, since the start of the Syrian revolution. And what is happening in Aleppo now is one example. I mean, what's happening in Aleppo now happened in Homs more than 3 years ago. It happened in Daraya, it happened in Qusayr, it happened everywhere.
What do you want the international community
We
to
want
do?
the international community to uphold the international law. We live in a planet where there is international law.
What does that mean? Because for people listening around the world, does that mean that troops from my country should be sent in? There should be bombing campaigns? Because people always worry about this proxy war between the US and Russia.
Okay, listen, if you look at the Syrian people, when they started the revolution, they started it peacefully. They didn't want any kind of military confrontation with Assad. It was Assad who started the war against the Syrian people. It was Assad who was allowed by the international community to go far away in killing people and massacring people on daily basis, using all internationally banned weapons. And he used even food as a weapon of war. He used chemicals. He crossed all the red lines. He did whatever he wanted, and he hasn't been brought to justice by the international community. This is one. Second, I think there is hypocrisy from the stance of Western countries like Britain, the US and France, because how I look at it, when I see the Russians are intervening in Syria and Assad, they are targeting hospital in eastern Aleppo, and I know the American and the British and the French are there, and they are doing absolutely nothing to stop the bombing of hospitals, then they are part of it. This is how we look into it. Here in the Syria Solidarity Campaign, we have been campaigning for Aleppo. This Saturday, we have a huge march across central London. We call on all human beings to join us, to write to their MPs, to call on the British government to take their responsibility as the permanent member of the UN Security Council.
Well, let's pick up the issue of the UN with Charles briefly, finally, if you would, Charles. The United Nations able to do anything on this?
I think I think what the conflict in Syria over the last several years has shown about the United Nations more than anything is that it's just completely paralysed. The system as it is, with 5 Security Council members, who obviously certain members of which have taken opposing sides on this conflict, means that this very little of any kind of meaningful consequences is able to come from the Security Council. Of course, now more recently we've seen attempts to use the General Assembly to make a significant statement of opposition to the Assad regime, and I think that can have an effect. But ultimately speaking, we're still basically going to wait and hope for the United States to do something. Ultimately, no European country is going to act by itself on this. I think that's been shown.
It's going to be interesting, isn't it, with Donald Trump coming into the White House in January, and he is a lot warmer towards Russia, so time will tell. Thank you so much for joining us, Charles Lister, Rami Jarrah, and also we heard from Abdulaziz al-Mashi.